So, Asteroids was a pretty good game, but this is 2023, and nearly every game at this rate is being made in Unreal Engine 5. You know, the funny game engine that built Fortnite, your favorite game, and every game dev's wet dream. So what I've done is copy the trend of recreating old games on newer engines. I've decided to task myself with recreating Asteroids from 1979 back on the Atari, but in 3D. Now for this challenge, I never really set any time constraints or any huge deadlines. And obviously because I'm such a good developer, I did a lot of planning. The reason why I never set any deadlines was due to the fact that I was still in college. And funnily enough, I was studying game dev at the time. I had assignments and other projects I had to work on, so I wanted to try and separate my funny 3D space game with sentient asteroids that fly towards you like they have a mind of their own from my final college project. Before I get into the details, I just want to say the game is already out on Steam right now. For not a lot of money, I'll put a link down in the description down below. It's a very epic game, I promise. Please buy it so I can convince myself to make more games in the future. Thanks. So the starting concept in my brain was pretty simple. I just wanted to recreate a game from a time where I wasn't born and remake it so all the boomers get something to play so they can get excited about gaming, so they can relate to their grandchildren playing the latest Call of Duty, and then have a heart attack when they get told the storage requirement isn't in megabytes but actually gigabytes. Now at this point in time, I had a pretty good mental image of how I wanted the game to look and feel. I wanted the controls to function similar to No Man's Sky's spaceship, with the cursor at the center of the screen moving around based on where your aim is going to fire. Now because I'm a programmer, not an artist, I wanted to make the art direction of the game as easy as possible for me to create. To do this, I made use of my knowledge in the tech art field, which is basically programmer art but much more simplified. So I booted up Unreal Engine and created the base project. I was thinking about using the flying template at the time, but after having a play around with it, I didn't like how it really felt. So instead, I opted to create a project. Time I was pretty scared because my mind was basically just blank, and I was using this project to learn a bit of C++, and I had no idea where to begin. So, like every other game developer, I went to the internet and YouTube. I was probably scrolling through videos and forums for hours and hours until I had a basic understanding of how to implement C++ into Unreal Engine. Thankfully, I already have about 3 to 4 years of TypeScript programming behind me, so I could use those transferable skills and knowledge into my C++ programming. And after a couple of days of playing around and learning, I had a little box that would fly around in a deep, dark, cold void of space, just like real life. Anyway, because at this point in time I had no plans to turn this into a YouTube devlog, I had no footage, so take this video of a cat doing something funny or cute, I don't know, I'll put it in post. Now, seeing a flying box in space is pretty cool, but it would be even cooler if it was a spaceship flying through, well, space. So that's exactly what I did. So I made a spaceship. Again though, I'm not an artist, and at this point in time, my 3D modeling knowledge was very limited. So I ended up coming out with this. I know, right? I should be hired as the lead artist for the next upcoming Call of Duty game. Now, word of warning, my understanding of UV maps was practically Thanos snapped out of existence. So if you're a 3D modeler and watching this right now, I'm sorry in advance. Anyway, I imported this mess of a model into the project and replaced it with the funny cube. So now we have a funny spaceship flying around in the deep dark cold void of space. Title card, I put quotation marks over the art, and that's because there's nothing in the game that I personally would call art, but obviously that's subjective. Now you could say the aesthetics is art, but in my eyes that's more technical art than what would be considered traditional art, if you know what I mean, lol. Then the only other piece of art in the game would be the UI, which we'll get onto later on in the video. So I just mentioned the aesthetics of the game. This is what the game used to look like. Pretty bad, I know. With the new version, I wanted to capture the vibe of a 1970s arcade game. Now, you might be wondering how I did this, my sweet summer child. Well, it's pretty simple. Kinda. I use Unreal Engine's wonderful tool called the post-process effect. Without this, the game would practically be null and void. The post-process effectively takes all the information from the screen, all the data from the level, and does whatever you tell it to do in post. So you can use this tool for creating effects that apply to the world on a global scale, like a Minecraft shader that you'd use to impress your friends because you have such a beefy PC that can run Minecraft at 60 FPS. with dynamic shadows and leaves that move in the wind. Now how I used the post-process effect was by looking up tutorials on YouTube on how to get outlines on game objects. I ended up finding a video on how to create outlines, but then I made a mistake while following the tutorial. However, this mistake ended up being a blessing in disguise, as it basically ended up creating the final version of the post-process effect that I would use for the rest of the creation of the game. Moving on to models, there were 2 more models left to create that were on the backlog of my mind. I needed the asteroids and the flying saucers. The saucers are pretty simple to make, as it was basically just a bean inside of a squashed circle, so I whipped that out pretty quickly. Again, with pretty much no work done on the UVs, so again, I'm sorry any artist out there. But thankfully for me, the post-process effect did all the heavy lifting for me. Now the work done on the asteroids was a little bit more interesting. I found there was a plugin in Blender that allowed you to create different rock types, and lucky for me, there was a preset exactly for meteorites, so I just generated around 20 different types of meteorites and imported those into the project. The plan in my head was for the engine to choose a new mesh every single time an asteroid would spawn. And speaking of spawning asteroids, that's the next topic I'll be moving on to now. It's called Meteorites 3D, and that's because I'm terrified of Atari coming out of their retirement home and quick-scoping my game out of existence. Or because the name says asteroids and it's pretty much a recreation of their IP, but we won't tell them that. After many hours of programming and testing and failing and testing and failing and testing and failing, and then learning what the definition of insanity is.
The definition of insanity is doing the exact same fucking thing over and over again, expecting shit to change. That is crazy.
Thank you, Vas. I managed to get a working system where asteroids would spawn a distance away from you and then launch towards you like a TikTok user on their way to comment on your latest post on God skull emoji. I would also try to make sure that they would always spawn behind you as to avoid pop-in, but if you swing around fast enough you'll probably end up seeing it anyway. And then afterwards I made sure that if you fire into these asteroids, they'll split into 2 and half the size, gaining you more points as you progressively destroy them. So let's recap. We have a spaceship, 1970s arcade aesthetics, and asteroids that try to rage bait you. So now we're done, right? I wish. Sadly, game dev is not that simple. We have so many other things to add like UI, music, collisions, and many other features that would bore you if I talked about them in this video. So to speed things up, let's say I've done those things already and you don't have to watch me doing that. And also because I never actually recorded any footage when I was doing it. And now we're looking at adding the last key feature into the game. The saucers. Now, fun fact, a lot of people that I know never actually knew that flying saucers were even in the game, probably because they were never able to get them to spawn, as you need to get 40,000 points in the game to even get the small saucers to spawn. So to get the saucers to work for me, I needed some prerequisites built. And thankfully at this point in time, because we totally didn't skip anything, most of those core features have already been added, allowing me to make dynamic game objects, so adding another entity for the spaceship to interact with wasn't actually that hard. The only aspect I genuinely struggled with was making sure the saucers spawned in and moved in the correct pattern towards the player. The goal for their movement was to make them chase the player around, but always stay above them to make sure they could fire at the player as much as possible during its lifespan. If the player ever goes above them, they'll be unable to fire. If I didn't prevent that, then the saucer would just end up game ending itself with its own projectiles. But now in the end, everything worked out fine, and now we have a functioning game. We're finally at the end stretch now, and we have a few more touch-ups to add, like that UI cursor I mentioned earlier. This was the only instance during the project where I did any actual traditional art for the game, and that's the story of how I installed Clip Studio Paint. I drew a couple different versions of the UI crosshair, so players could add different choices on what they would want on their screen. I then created a little selection menu on the main menu. By the way, I made a main menu, which you could then use to select what type of crosshair you'd want. Initially, I had some issues to get the crosshair to follow where your mouse would go, similar to the No Man's Sky controls, but after some tweaking, I finally got something that would be seen as functional. I also then threw in some other things like a leaderboard and then some options you could use to filter through that leaderboard, such as a local filter so you can see where you place on the leaderboard globally. Then I added an extra button so you can filter through just friends, so you can put yourself at the top because you have no friends. Finally, I forgot to add a lifespan to the asteroids, so if you never shot them, they would just keep on spawning on you and gank you like they're playing Dark Souls. Thankfully, that was a pretty easy fix. Now after all this time passed, I jumped from being a college student to a university student, still studying game design, and I finally got the game game ready for release, as I was just about halfway through the year on my new course. I've also been sprinkling some of the gameplay over the course of the video, which you may have seen. If you want a full look at how the game plays, you can check out the gameplay trailer on my channel, which will also be linked down below. I'll also put it in one of the title cards up here. I'm not sure which side it's on, as this is my first time recording. So before I end this video, I just want to say a few final things. I want to thank one of my good friends who helped create the track for this game. He has his own channel called Junkitt. You should have a look at what he does there. I don't know what he does, I just know he does things on video. Oh, and he also makes some pretty funky music. He's also a struggling student in debt, just like me. And don't forget to check out the game's page on Steam, which again will be linked down below, with a bunch of other things. Also, come check out my Discord because I'm trying to get that up and running to start building a community. And finally, if you want to see any more videos just like this, or have any suggestions for any other games I can make, or any other recreations of games I can make that you would like to see in the future, write a comment about it so I can steal it to make more money, because Pyro doesn't pay me enough to keep the lights on. And it happened again.
I used to